moth, which I'll show you right here. So you can see those smaller branches. So this is called quadrupectinate. Again, still given that kind of feathery appearance. And then also, it's fairly common to see moths with just a thin thread-like antenna. Butterflies, on the other hand, typically have a small rod with a little knob at the end. So we call it club-like antenna. And this is a tiny little butterfly, really cool butterfly that'll hang around by grass and loves to feed on clover, which is, you know, something a lot of people try to get rid of, but an important little flower for butterflies and moths. So we're going to play a little game. You don't have to answer, just think to yourself. Is it a butterfly? Is it a moth? I'll give you a few seconds and I'll tell you the answer. So looking at this guy, see it's kind of got a thick body, kind of drab color. It is a butterfly because it's got one of the easiest ways, as I mentioned, is really to go for the antenna. It's got that thin rod with a bulb at the end. So it's got that club-like antenna.
But if you were going by the body, Jay, that does look like a moth. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes I'll mention it, which I forget to even think about, but this was shot right here in Southold. Most of these photos are right in my backyard or close by. This is actually at Custer Preserve. So moth or butterfly, this might be a little unfair because I'm talking about the antenna, but if you follow this down, right here is a little bit of a knob. And this is one of my favorite butterflies. I'm hoping to get some newer, updated, better pictures of this one. But this is a juniper hair-streak. I would say hair-streak butterflies for birders is kind of like warblers. So when you see hair-streaks, people go a little crazy. Butterflyers go a little nuts over hair-streaks. They're tiny little butterflies, really pretty, really intricate markings. So here you really can't see the antenna, but you can see the hairiness, and so it probably, you're probably thinking moth right away. And it is right, but I had to throw this in here because it is not as we would think of, but moths, of course, as drab and whatever. So it's definitely not drab. It's got some really cool colors. I have a better photo a little later I'll show you. And again, moth or butterfly, you can see that we have the knobs here. This is a painted lady butterfly. Beautiful, pretty common butterfly. Anytime I want to try to confuse anybody with moth or butterfly, I will go with these guys. Here you can see the proboscis rolled up here.
Looks like a moth to me.
Yeah, but looking closely at the antenna, you see the knob at the end, and it is a skipper, Zabulon skipper. Fast little day flying, obviously day flyer, it's a butterfly. Fast little butterflies. So again, this, and the reason why this is in the moth or butterfly game is, again, kind of goes against what the generalizations are. It's holding its wings. This guy's holding its wings vertically. It is a moth. A really interesting moth, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And just a couple more and we'll move on. Again, we'll see this. You can see a tiny bit of its antenna up here. This is a lesser maple spanworm moth, and it's this one I found in the daytime. And this is a daytime flying butterfly, so they're both white. But I mean, this one's not going to fly much in the daytime, only if you scare it up. That's what happened to me. I flushed this guy, so I took a picture of it, just walking through. But this guy is a common European cabbage butterfly, cabbage white. All right, so this is one of my favorite things about moths. This is their camouflage. So it's incredible. One of the things I really try to do the last few years is capture their camouflage. So spent a lot of time trying to find them and photograph them. And I'll show you some of these pictures. So this guy's just doing its best to try to blend in as a dead leaf.
Now, Jay, could I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Why Why are these moths camouflaging themselves?
So really during the day, they're not flying, right? So butterflies are flying around and feeding. Moths are sitting still during the day. So they're camouflaging themselves just to avoid getting eaten by birds, really.
Okay.
That's their main threat. So if they can blend in and a bird can't see them, then they'll be in good shape. So some of these in the beginning, you can see some of the color schemes match the branches, although it might not be as great of examples of camouflage. As we move further, I'll get better and better examples. So you can see this blends in pretty well. Plus, when I took these pictures, I came up pretty close. From a distance, a little harder to see them. This guy blended in really well, but as I moved closer to it, started to open up its wings, and it does that as a defense mechanism. It tries to blend in, and then if you get too close, it'll open its wings and shock you with the orange. So it's a subfamily of moths called underwings. And here again, we have a moth that likes to hide in lichen. It's got that kind of lichen color. You can see the black here like that. Tough to see from a distance. Zoomed up close, you can really see it.
Jay, I have a question that was put in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Quick question. Do the sizes, shapes of the moth combs differ because they are specific to detecting certain pheromones? Does each type of moth only detect pheromones of its specific species?
That's a pretty,
Wow, that's a good question.
yeah, it's pretty, very involved and very thoughtful question. So I really can't answer that as well as I would hope to be able to. Just, I don't really know the science behind, why some of them. I mean, obviously, I know that the gypsy moth with the really big branches on its antenna need that because of the fact that the female doesn't fly. So it's got to be able to catch those pheromones from a distance. But so my guess is that the ones that don't need it are the females, and the males are, flying around and able to find each other a little easier. But I really don't know the science behind that. That's definitely something to look into. Excellent question. Thank you.
Well, it's a great question.
Yeah, so a lot of this is as my father-in-law was talking about earlier. It's just kind of self-taught. Whatever interests me, I read on it and studied it, tried to identify them, which is a real challenge because there's about 800 species of butterflies in North America. There's 12,000 species of moths, close to 12,000. So just trying to narrow it down sometimes can be a little tricky. And in a lot of cases, you can't even narrow it down to the species level. You would need DNA. This is really from me turning over a leaf. So I turned over the perfect leaf there and found this guy hiding underneath it. And it's exactly what I was trying to do, trying to find him, so that's an easy way of finding some insects sometimes. Turn over a leaf that might be hiding, cling underneath there.
Hmm.
And you can see the color scheme here blending in nicely. This is a little better because I'm back a little further, so it blends in a little better. Some of those pictures I was really kind of close up, so you can see the insect well. But so there it is right here, this little moth here blending in. So this is not blending in at all. But the
Mhm.
purpose of this photo is when I went first time to go see this moth, I didn't even think, I just thought it was going to be easy to find. Here it is. Look at its color. It's beautiful. But it wasn't as easy to find. They actually blended in fairly well sometimes. So here's a scanned back picture. I pan back a little bit. So the colors of this inkberry in October, kind of blend in. So you can see the whites blending in with the branches and the orangey scales here blending in with the colors. So it was kind of interesting. Here, I thought this was neat because I thought these were, the main purpose was to kind of mimic an eye spot. But, looking at this photo and finding this guy sitting right next to this, I thought that was interesting and might have really trying to mimic a broken off little twig.
Interesting.
Here's just another nice two views of this guy blending in very well. Another one that's tough to see, blending in really well. Might be the best camouflage picture I have. The only reason I found that is he moved. The wind blew. And this is really cool too. You can see this is the same twig. So here's a piece of curled up bark, and here is this moth mimicking curled up bark.
Wow, it looks like bark. Doesn't
Yeah.
even look like a moth.
Yeah. So if you had, you know, they were a little too far up. I couldn't get them both in the same frame. So I just had to take 2 pictures. This again, when I saw this moth a few times, so one of the ways I see them is I'll put on my lights and attract them to, you know, to my yard. I have a couple lights I put on, and I try to be very respectful with that and not keep them on long and let them go about their business. But anyways, when I first saw this moth a few times, I'm like, why does it curl its abdomen the way it does? But you can see here, it's really mimicking these broken off branches here. So it's looking like a little twig. And I'll show you from the side view of the moth. You can see the moth a little better. So here, if you look at that slide very quickly, it looks like a bunch of leaves, but I'll go back. And then if you look at it a little longer, I think you can probably pick out most of the moths that are mimicking leaves. And there's our moths. So another cool thing that a couple moths do is brilliant. Instead of trying to blend in with the environment, they're trying to blend in with bird dropping. So their main predator during the daytime is birds, at nighttime it's bats. So this one zoomed up, beautiful. Literally, that's the name. It's not my adjective. It's the name of this moth is beautiful wood nymph. Another really interesting thing, there's been some studies in the last few years on this particular moth, the greater wax moth. And this moth they tested and found out that it has the best hearing of any animal. So we hear about 20 kilohertz, and dogs hear frequencies of 30 kilohertz. This moth is incredible, has incredible hearing up to 300 kilohertz, 10 times the hearing of dogs.
Amazing.
Then that kind of, you know, begs the question, well, why? And the main reason is for their nocturnal predator, the bats. So bats are doing the ultrasound, they're doing those high-pitched clicks. So this moth has adapted to hear them from a distance and you know, then try to avoid the moth for the bat for survival. It's also an interesting moth because it actually lays its eggs in honey, you know, honeycomb, and it feeds on the wax of the honeycomb. And they're doing some studies right now, and the caterpillars are actually seem to be able to digest plastic. So pretty interesting. We'll see how that can help us in the future. So I'm just gonna go through some of my favorite families, and we're getting into maybe some of the fun stuff here. So the micro moths, this is one of my favorite moths. This moth is really tiny, and I'll show you in the next. The micro moths, there are lots of different families, all really kind of clustered under the term micro moths. Some of them are really tiny, you know, only a few millimeters long. Some of them are a little bit bigger, but I'll show you. That's the same moth with a grain of rice in my wife's thumb there.
That's amazing.
That's a tiny little guy, again, with my macro lens and the Raynox, which is like a magnifying glass, zooming up to see the detail. This is a moth you can find both day and night. So especially in late August, September, when goldenrod is out, this moth is a great place to find it, sitting there feeding on it. And it'll also be one of the more common moths you'll see by your porch light. This is in the category of micro moths, but it happens to be a little bit bigger. A leopard moth, pretty cool looking guy. Another real tiny moth, about the same size as the one that I had showed you with the grain of rice, and kind of a similar looking moth, very closely related. This moth, again, really tiny, grain of rice size. It's really interesting. Sometimes you'll see it perched just like this, and sometimes upside down hanging like that. So I just thought it was really neat the way it had these legs in the front, and the other two legs are just kind of hugging the body there.
Very fragile looking, Jay?
Yeah, yeah. Pyralids are named because they kind of have that triangle or pyramid kind of look. And so I'm not going to go through too many of them, but I did want to highlight this one. This was from Laurel Lake, and I was waiting out on the lily pads photographing some damselflies, and I found this guy. So they're in a genus of moths where the caterpillars are actually aquatic. So they're the only genus of moths that have aquatic caterpillars, which is pretty neat. So they'll be in the water feeding on the stems of water lilies. And there's my younger daughter, Violet, from many years ago. She is now a sophomore. And so, again, this is probably almost 10 years ago. I'm not sure how long, but maybe 8 years ago. So we were kayaking, and this is actually underneath the LIE. And the reason why this is in there, because nice unexpected find at the end of the tunnel. Again, this was when I was kayaking, I wasn't taking any, and even at that time, I wasn't as good at photographing and didn't have as good equipment either. But it's just kind of interesting. Another one of those moths in that same genus where the caterpillars are aquatic. And then we get into a noctuid family. It's the largest family of moths. Pretty much they're nocturnal. These guys I really think are really cool. I showed one of them earlier where they open up their wings and show off their color to scare a potential predator. I'm just going to highlight some of the more interesting noctuids. These are interesting. I think they're really cool looking, and this particular moth is so variable. So that can make it a little challenging identifying it too. It could be because there's other Zale moths that are similar looking. And this, there's, if you looked it up, there's so many different variations in its coloring. This is one of those moths that we get pretty excited, us moth nerds, we get pretty excited to see. This is Harris's 3-spot. Cool. Very cool looking moth. And I get it probably once a year. I find it once a year. This is a pretty common moth. Again, nocturnal, so we're not necessarily going to see them. But if you did put on a porch light, you would probably see it. This took me many years to find. I was jealous of a lot of people who would come in school because they know I love moths and say, hey, I found this, in my yard, and there'd be this moth. They spotted at paddle-loads, and I'm saying, I still haven't seen this. So it probably took me about 10 years to find one finally. I like this moth in both views, but I think the head-on view is pretty cool. You can see those long tufts. Its head right here. Interesting looking moth. Decent sized moth, couple, probably 1.5 inches. The markings here reminded the first person who found it and named it as Hebrew writing. This is probably not going to be the most beautiful photo or whatever, but just something I really liked. I just love the textures. The back little white kind of balls here are really from clover flowers, actually, just kind of out of focus in the distance. And then here's the head-on shot of that cool moth. And I just said Daytana moth because that's the genus. So to get down to the species level of this particular moth, for the most part, you need DNA. So I don't do that. I don't want to collect them and send them for the DNA. Collect them means I kill them. So, I like to photograph them and let them go. All right. So then we get into a little bit more of the crowd pleaser, popular families. So the tiger moths, and you'll see why they're typically called tiger moths. But they do have these bold patterns, usually very colorful and pretty much alerting everybody, just like the monarch does. Like, don't eat me, I'm poisonous. And one of the moths in the tiger moths is this Isabella tiger moth, and its caterpillar is probably more famous, the woolly bear caterpillar. And again, a very old picture. And a really interesting thing is and this bat is an internet photo. The moth here is a shrunken photo of one of mine, but incredibly, tiger moths are able to make a clicking sound that can jam and confuse the sonar of bats. So, so
Amazing.
much in a similar way that cicadas make their buzzing sound, it's a membrane in the thorax that they use. They kind of expand it and snaps back into place to make the clicking sound. It's pretty neat. Whereas the cicadas, they vibrate that membrane in the thorax to make that is vibrating. And apparently this year we're supposed to get a lot of cicadas. That's what I heard. We'll see. So I have a salt marsh moth, and here it kind of gives us its name, the tiger moth. There's a lot of moths like this here in this family. One of my favorite tiger moths. This was just about to take off because he didn't like it in this picture taken, but I was able to get him with his wings open so you can see the cool yellow body. Again, another one where you need DNA to differentiate either banded or sycamore. Here's a giant leopard moth. You can even see on the blue here, you can see some scales that kind of fell off here. But beautiful, beautiful moth, beautiful coloring. And before I got into, photographing moths, and, I would have never in a million years realized something like this was a moth. Just these kind of colors, that kind of pattern, and they have very small scales here. And then inchworm moths, so often called looper moths. So these are the inchworms that you find hanging from the tree, and they'll kind of inch their way as they walk across. These are the moths from inchworm moths, and some of them are pretty interesting. This you can find. This is chickweed. Chickweed is a native plant. I don't even know if it's native actually, but it is it's also known as blue sailors. It's a little wildflower. So the caterpillar feeds on that. And if you walk through like a field, you might kick them up. In fact, I've kicked these up, I think, even pumpkin picking. Some more interesting inchworm moths. A lot of time with birds, you'll see common tern, and it's really not common anymore. But this still is common. It's, again, you put a porch light on in May, June, you'll get a bunch of these guys. Emerald moths, they're pretty popular, a lot of green. So I mentioned this earlier. This was in the moth butterfly game, this red fringed emerald moth. So just amazing adaptation. So if this emerges from its cocoon stage as an adult in early spring, it'll be brown. If it emerges in summer or late spring, it'll emerge as this greenish color. So something chemically happens so that it emerges brown, so it blends in with the dead leaves, and versus emerging a little later and green. It's pretty fascinating. And then there's even an intermediate that it's like brown and green. Now we get into the big famous moth. So if you went to the Atlantis and you went into their butterfly exhibit, they usually have a couple cool moths in there too, like these guys. So they're going to be big. They're going to be like, this guy would fill up my whole hand, polyphemus moth. And they are in the silkworm family. And the reason is, they make silk. This cocoon, these are not my photos. Again, some more photos that are not mine, but this is the famous silkworm from Asia. And they will take the threads of that silk here to make the dresses. So here's just a sample of a silk wedding gown made from this guy. So pretty important and pretty interesting moth. So I showed you earlier a photograph of the coastal barrens buck moth that I got flying. This is one that I found perched. Here's another shot of the polyphemus moth. This is definitely one of the moths that I found early on when I was birding. I found one that must have been scared up somewhere and it was kind of faded and dying. But I was just like, wow, and that kind of got me hooked into trying to learn more about these. Here's Io moth showing off its beautiful eye spots. The famous Luna moth. And that was another moth that I had no luck for a long time. Finally, I got him. And I probably average of seeing one a year. So yeah, the adults live such a short life. Here's the face of the Luna moth. You don't even see a proboscis. They don't even have one. It's reduced and gone because they don't even feed. So a lot of moths actually don't feed as adults. They just live off of the fat stored from the caterpillar stage. And we're talking 10 days maybe as an adult. That's it. Which is crazy to think, this beautiful creature, but it has I guess a long life from caterpillar to cocoon and then to adult. Sphinx moths. These are really fast flying moths, very cool. Some fly during the day. And again, another internet photo of a stealth jet that kind of remind me and potentially even inspired the design. Who knows? I don't know. I should know. But anyways, so yeah, they can fly up to 30 miles an hour. Yeah, it's incredible. So that's going to be one of their adaptations to survive, is to be able to fly away fast. It's a beautiful one from my backyard. Another common one. I have a lot of Virginia creeper vine in my yard and around. So I get a lot of these moths. Very similar looking moth is the azalea sphinx. Blind-eyed sphinx, very interesting wing shape here. And also another fast flyer.
And Jay, when it says azalea moth, that usually means it's attracted the caterpillar to that flower?
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, so excellent point. A lot of them are named after the host plant, what the caterpillar feeds on. And this is named after, and I'll show you a better picture to describe this, but there are two similar sphinx moths, and one has a little marking that looks kind of like a pupil, and one doesn't. So the one that doesn't is known as the blind-eyed sphinx. And this, again, another moth that I was really hoping to find, and a few years went by, and I finally got to see one. Beautiful Pandora sphinx. Here's a side view of a small-eyed sphinx, just to kind of see the way its abdomen is shaped when it's perched. And that same small-eyed sphinx has inspired, it's not just me who thinks it's beautiful. It inspired a design. This dress was designed after this moth by Alexander McQueen. So my in-laws and my wife kind of introduced me to him. He did a whole line of dresses designed after moths. This is the only one I have a picture of, so this is the only one I'm going to show you. And that right there is probably my favorite picture I've taken of a moth.
Why do you like this one, Jay?
Well, I don't know. I just think it, the colors of this moth, it's one of my favorite moths. I got its wing spread to get to see the little eye. And it's interesting too. This little black in here is kind of, whoever named it was kind of calling that like a little black pupil, and some of them have a little bit more of a dot in the middle. Not, they are slightly variable. But yeah, I just like the way this cut, like the way the whole picture came out, and like the lighting in it, everything.
Yeah, it almost looks fluorescent, part of the wings that are bright. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's it. So basically I like to end, look at this quote, and that's pretty much me. I could spend hours just walking through some of the plants in my backyard and seeing all these things.
Just would invite our viewers. I mean, I'm not sure if you want to turn on your voice and ask some questions of Jay.
Mhm.
He certainly welcomes it. If not, please put some questions in the chat. Katie says, fabulous photos and information, Jay.
Okay,
And Gary says, thank you. Incredible photos.
thanks. Very cool. It's very cool to have a group of people that want to hear about moths.
Also, Katie mentioned that lights attract moth, but she's read about people attracting moths with fruit and sugar recipes.
Yes.
Is there any downside to doing this for moths?
No, in fact, it's probably more of an upside. So the what we call it mung. So yeah, rotten fruit, and so some butterflies and some moths, that's what they're looking for. That's what they feed on. So
So
they're
how would you put that out? How would you?
so you kind of you can take old bananas, mash it up, old peaches, mash it up, let it ferment, and then you put it out and you can just literally just wipe it on a tree, a vertical tree, or sometimes what I've done is put it like a board outside and let them come that way. And even during the daytime, you can check it because there's a couple of butterflies that'll visit. And honestly, to make it a little bit more productive, and I learned this when I was a park ranger from a couple brilliant naturalists, they even pour a tiny, tiny bit of beer and let it kind of, evaporate the alcohol, but still that kind of fermented smell helps attract them. Because again, they're looking for rotten, fermented kind of fruit that they can easily drink.
Well, leave it to park rangers to find many uses for beer. I
Yeah.
always thought they were clever people.
But I do that. I do that also. That's how I attract some of them that way. And the lights that I use too is I use black lights, the CFL black lights, those fluorescent black lights. I use a couple of those. And again, I don't like to leave them on so long. So if I put them on at night and I don't check them, and I go to bed early, I get up super early, well before sunrise, check the lights, turn off the lights, let them go and take off. Because if I don't turn off the lights before sunrise, a lot of them will stay, and then my birds will come and eat them all. So I really don't want to do that to them. Kind of bring them in to be, food.
So I'm just going to mention, Jay, there's a lot of thank yous here. Carol, thank you. So interesting. Katie, thank you so much. Barbara, I'm a moth lover as well. Great shots. Aaron says, great presentation. Photos and background information were amazing. My wife just said, quote, wow, I have a new appreciation for moths.
Oh, there you go.
So with that, Jay, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. We all appreciate, what you do and your love for the environment and the ecosystem, inspires us too, to protect it as much as we can.
And along those lines, if you want to get more variety in your yard, plant native stuff, native everything, flowers, bushes, trees, all of that will get. There's moths that feed on everything. Moths that caterpillars eat lichen, eat dead leaves, eat dandelions. Everything that you see occurring around, there's a moth that feeds on it and thrives off of it.
Gail is asking, have you noticed a decline in moth numbers as woodlands are cut?
So, my sample is really just mainly in my own yard. I do visit some preserves to see them, and I honestly have not seen a drastic decline. I have in a couple of species, and that's probably due to those, host plants being eradicated in my area. So it's not really a good sample to really generalize, but from my perspective, from my area, it seems to be the population, generally speaking, overall is maintaining, fairly consistent in the last 10 years.
If there's one native plant you would recommend if you could only buy one, is there any? Any particular one?
Well, so honestly, if I was going to say a tree, I would go with an oak or a cherry because they are so good for birds, butterflies, and moths. Um,
Gotcha.
but as far as a plant or a flower, you really can't go wrong. In fact, what I would probably do is just get a little bit of a variety. Um,
Hmm.
you
I
know,
hear you.
yeah, and people have been on the kick for monarchs. They've been planting a lot of milkweed, but that helps moths too. There are moths that feed on milkweed. So there's a couple. There's a tiger moth that specializes on milkweed. So yeah, and you'll get to see some butterflies feeding on it when it flowers. So that might be a good plant to plant. That might be for all the way around for butterflies and moths.
Good place to start. Well,
Yeah,
again, Jay, I want to thank you so much, especially on behalf of Mattituck-Laurel Library for doing this presentation for us. So thank you so much.
you're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
All right, everybody, have a good night.